We're going to talk about China. A lot of you may have seen, I'm sure you saw some of the pictures, some of the clips, some of the images from the spectacular military parade that was put on in Beijing by Xi Jinping, and it really got attention around the world. And so to figure out what we should make of that, and more broadly, this whole posture of China and the United States at this point and what it means for the future, I am really happy to be joined by James Mulvenon, who, as he just reminded me, is my wife's former boss, but more importantly, he's I think, one of the smartest people I've ever heard talk on China. He's often briefing Congress and others. Chief Intelligence Officer at Pamir Consulting. That's one of those kind of spooky firms, right? But more important for our purposes, I've always found you clear as a bell on what is happening over there. And so when Johanna said, look at this parade, you should have James on it, I thought it was a great idea. James Mulvenon, thank you.
Yeah. No, happy to be here. Happy to be here. And I was already previously a subscriber to your Substack and everything else. And now I'm on it.
That's good. That's good. Early days, old dog, new tricks here. But one of the things I love about this space is that the people come on, they're interested in the subject, and they want in-depth. They want an authentic and in-depth discussion of whatever the subject matter is. And today it is China, and particularly the military side of it. All right. So to begin with, those pictures, those images, right? They were beautiful in a way, right? I always thought that the Vatican, which I covered over the years, does big events, as well as anybody in the world. But I'll tell you, Xi Jinping gave the Pope a run for his money, his Peter's pence, because they were beautiful. And the precision and the glamour of it almost were dazzling. I'm sure that was the intended effect. But as somebody who's well steeped in the Chinese government and the military, what did you see there that stood out for you? Just a general question. What did you see in that parade?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're right that it's a tremendous spectacle. And, you could go all the way back to the 2008 Beijing Olympic opening ceremony. They have a love for sort of large scale, extreme precision, right? So just this morning, I was watching a video of soldiers not goose step marching, but actually sort of jogging in exact precision in a unit past the rows of tanks. Now, the cynic in me says, I know how long it takes to train the units to do that. And all the time they spent training to goose step up and down Chang'an Boulevard in Beijing, they weren't spending time training to invade Taiwan. So, there is an actual cost to doing this, but it was certainly meant to awe. It was shock and awe. And I think just as important was, and we'll talk about this eventually, I'm sure, Terry, was the combination of very nice people that he was on the rostrum with, watching this as a statement of sort of the unity of sort of the axis of chaos, and also their attendant overwhelming military power that they have. And it was those two things in combination. The fact that despite the Ukraine war and everything else, they continue to be lips and teeth, as Mao used to say about the relationship with North Korea and China. And yet, since 1998, we see now the culmination of this massive military modernization, which in many ways is terrifying because of the implications of some of the systems that they put on display.
Well, let's talk about that. First, the axis of chaos. I like that. And it was up there, though. I think Japan sent a representative, right?
Oh, sure. No, there were other countries there, but obviously, the appearance of Putin and Kim Jong Un was the primary, and as with any Pekingologist, you had to analyze who was standing closest to Xi on the rostrum to understand the relative importance of the people that were up there. But what you saw on that parade, very simply stated, was the cream of the crop of the most advanced parts of China's military modernization, with a disproportionate focus on systems that could, negatively affect our ability to defend Taiwan, and even systems capable of hitting the United States. So you didn't see, like in traditional old school parades, you'd have a lot of tanks and you'd have a lot of marching soldiers and things like that for a land war. But, as we know, no land wars in Asia, right? But what we saw was really the cutting edge of their intercontinental ballistic missiles and their hypersonic glide vehicles and their long range strategic UAV, unmanned aerial vehicles, all of the things that allow China to project power out deep into the Pacific and eventually globally, thus threatening the ability of the United States to fulfill its treaty commitments in the Western Pacific to Japan and the Philippines and South Korea. And then
Well,
most importantly, our ambiguity with regard to the defense of Taiwan.
right. Let's get to that. But it sounds like then, and I guess this is obvious, one of the intended audiences for this was the Pentagon.
Right. There were a number of intended audiences. One was a domestic. I think it's often a mistake that we make, that we see all Chinese signaling as for external consumption. This is as much about Xi's consolidation of his power, and his oft-stated China dream and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and his goals for making this the Chinese century, and all of the sort of time hacks that he's put out for 2030 and 2050 and other places. So fundamentally, this was, and you can see this from the propaganda apparatus in Chinese, primarily yet another signal associating Xi Jinping, the leader, the chairman of everything, with the rise of China and its military might as a manifestation of that power. But of course, they allowed international broadcast for a reason, and it was also a direct warning to China's neighbors as well as the United States, that this is not a country that you can push around anymore. This is not a country that you can nuclear blackmail anymore. That in fact, Chairman Mao's dictum in 1949 that China had stood up is now backed by modern military firepower, that in fact can defend that at any level geopolitically.
Hmm. And thinking of Chairman Mao, is there any significance to the immaculately tailored and beautiful fabric Mao suit that Xi Jinping himself wore? I remember my parents were regular subscribers to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra back in the 60s and 70s, and there was a delegation from what was
Mhm.
Mao's China still. And they had seen everybody wore the Mao suit back then. But my mom and dad were seated near them and said they had the most beautiful fabrics, right? Okay, so Xi
Yeah, yeah.
Jinping has that, but any significance to that? He's the new Mao, I guess is what he's trying to communicate.
Well, yeah. So Xi Jinping has a variety of uniforms, including he has his own digital camo uniform that he wears in his role as the commander in chief, which is slightly different than everyone else's uniforms. And designing, by the way, designing your own military uniform, as we learned in the Sacha Baron Cohen movie General Admiral Alendine, that's kind of, you're in Gaddafi territory when you start designing your own uniforms. But he wears digital camo when he's with the troops, and he wears a green mouse suit when he's at formal military occasions, and he wears a black mouse suit for really significant party occasions. I even had one when I lived in China. I had one that was a worker one, which was dark blue. And I actually still have it, but I don't fit in it, obviously. It's more for nostalgia than anything else. But it was really that was a real lot of internal signaling. That was signaling that said that this military might was only achievable under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And by wearing the sort of formal uniform of the Chinese Communist Party, he was reminding everyone that the military is not separate, that it is an armed vanguard of the party, and that the one of the things the party is most concerned about all the time, which has led to this massive set of corruption purges within the Chinese military, is that the military remain under the total and supreme control of the Communist Party at all times.
And that's what he's essentially saying there. But let me
Yeah.
let me turn back to this notion of the other audiences and the near neighbors. Well, let's talk about Taiwan in particular. So how much of, you said the bulk of it, of that hardware that we saw rolling down the avenues in Beijing is a message to Taiwan and would be useful should Taiwan need to be retaken by force, which is something that that Xi Jinping has essentially vowed, right?
Right. And I mean it's multi-layered. There were systems in that parade that would be used directly on Taiwan. And then but the more interesting thing was the systems that would be used to deter or to defeat the intervention of other near country neighbors and alliances as well as the United States. So when you look at the ranges of some of the missiles, they've been designed specifically for specific targets, like the DF-26. We call it the Guam killer because its actual range is perfect for hitting Guam, which is a U.S. territory, but we have Anderson Air Force Base there, which has B-2 strategic bomber shelters and Los Angeles class attack submarine berths, and a large, POL field is essential for logistics. So they see it as a sort of Fortress America on Guam. So they built a missile with a specific range to be able to hit Guam.
And how has the United States responded to that?
Well, it's interesting. We have continued to assert that pound for pound, dollar for dollar, our equipment and is more advanced. But the Chinese, and quite a few years ago, began overtaking us in raw numbers, whether it's gray hull naval shipbuilding, whether it's numbers of intermediate and sort of theater missiles, whether it's UAVs. So I would argue right now, and China specialists talk about what's called the first island chain, which is Japan through the Ryukyus to Taiwan to the Philippines, and then there's a second island chain farther out in the Pacific. The Chinese have created what Indo-Pacific Command calls a weapon engagement zone that is incredibly lethal out to that second island chain. And we do not have a lot of good options. And so a lot of the debate over the last 5 or 6 years has been, okay, we have to retreat out of that lethal weapons engagement zone and then try and fight our way back in. And so a lot of our doctrine and strategy and procurement has been based on giving up fixed bases in Japan, giving up fixed bases around the region, knowing that they would be destroyed by Chinese missiles, and being much more nimble and expeditionary about fighting our way back in.
Wow, I mean that is something that I did not know, that the American presence, forward presence in the Philippines, in Japan. I would have thought the opposite, James. I would have thought that maybe it was time for a kind of Pacific NATO with Australia, the Philippines, Japan, whomever. Essentially, the United States has very close defense relationships with each of those places, but linked. Instead, you're saying that the United States is essentially withdrawing its forward physical
No,
presence?
No, I don't. I don't want you to misunderstand me. What I was talking about was sort of the operational concept. I mean, so there's deterrence, which is absolutely, as was carried out mainly in the Biden administration, interlocking alliances and interlocking groups of people, like the Quad, right, which is Japan and India and Australia, and then other sort of trilateral linkages, doing a better job of getting the ROCs in South Korea and the Japanese and the US on a better footing. And so China does see itself being surrounded by this sort of multi-azimuth element of an Asian NATO. The Europeans, the Germans, the French, others have been doing naval exercises in the region. All of that is built around deterrence. What I was referring to was the operational concept, which is what do you do when the missiles start flying? Because the old model where we had fixed bases in Japan at Yokota and Kadena and all these other places, they're going to be smoking holes. And so we can't operate that close because of this massive missile force and hypersonic glide vehicle force that China's built. So operationally, we have to retrograde and then fight our way back in. And so each of the services, the Marines, the Air Force, the Army, have come up with these expeditionary concepts that they're trying to employ.
All because of this development of the Chinese military. So it
Yeah,
used
which
to
you
be,
saw in the parade. Yeah, which you saw
yes,
in the
and I mean now 20 some years ago when I covered the White House under George W. Bush, there was a feeling that while China had enormous numbers, their
Mhm.
stuff was not that great. and that it was not a hollow army, but one that the United States could manage. That's all changed. Yeah, give us a sense of the scale of both just the sheer firepower, hardware, systems, manpower, and the capacities of them. Since I covered this, secondarily through covering the White House.
Yeah, I would say, let's talk about some of those changes. So, since the 2000s, when we had the EP3A hostage crisis in Hainan Island, I get to call it a hostage crisis because I'm not a U.S. government employee. We have gone from a situation in which we had numerical and quality superiority in naval forces, air forces in the Pacific, to one in which the Chinese have overwhelming numerical superiority. Now, the asterisk I have to put there is to say none of these ships have ever been in combat before on the Chinese side. And so that's a big difference between the US military, which is obviously battle hardened after many, many years, and this recent collision of a Chinese gray hull frigate with a Chinese Coast Guard vessel doesn't give me a lot of confidence that their sort of at sea capabilities are necessarily world class. But at the same time, as my friend Joseph Stalin used to say, sometimes quantity has a quality all its own. And having overwhelming superiority in numbers of theater missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles and cruise missiles makes a big difference when you can then just overwhelm the defenses of US and Japanese and South Korean sort of allied military units. And so that's been a big change. And I mean, there are still areas of weakness. They're still not very good at undersea warfare. It's widely acknowledged that the U.S. Navy still sort of controls the submarine battle, or at least is dominant in the submarine battle. But it's just, Terry, it's just the sheer numbers of the kinds of weapons that they're able to put into that battle space that we just can't deal with.
And are those weapons? I mean, you talked about the range that they have, but is the major military goal near term, whether by pressure or by firepower, the retaking of Taiwan? And given the increase in capabilities and sheer numbers, does it make sense that the United States still guarantees essentially the independence of Taiwan?
Well, one thing that I always remind senior policymakers is that China has a political strategy for unification that has a military component, not a military strategy that has a political component. Okay. And I don't want to I don't want to violate Mulvenon's third law, which is, which is the value of any PowerPoint briefing on China in the Pentagon is inversely proportional to the number of Sun Tzu quotes in the briefing. But the Chinese would prefer to win without fighting. And so they would prefer a political solution, as opposed, because they realize that if they have to destroy most of Taiwan, that it makes it, not only is it ungovernable, but you've destroyed one of the largest economies in the world and an enormous source of economic dynamism and
Hmm.
and everything else. Um, that being said, we don't have a formal commitment to defend the island. I mean, this is the kind of diplomatic ambiguity that war criminal number one Henry Kissinger was always famous for, which I would argue has outlived its usefulness. 53 years later, but basically under the 82 U.S. law, under the Taiwan Relations Act, we are responsible for providing them with weapons of a defensive character, and that we have an interest in the peaceful resolution of what's going on. Now, one of the really interesting debates for what you've been working on recently is there's a huge debate inside the Pentagon because the very same defensive weapons that we would be giving to the Taiwans, we've been sending to the Ukrainians. And one thing that our Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Mr. Colby, has been saying is that it's zero sum. That the more weapons we send to the Ukers, the fewer we have to send to the Taiwans. And so the big debate is not, can the U.S. military by itself defend Taiwan, but what can we do to bolster Taiwan's ability to defend itself, and make it and to have enhance the deterrence of the Chinese
Right.
engaging in an attempt to take Taiwan.
Well, I mean, it would be obviously an amphibious invasion if it ever
Right.
came to that, and that would require. I mean, it's supposedly easy. It'd be a huge military challenge, from what I understand. It's not. It's not like Incheon or D-Day. It's much a greater distance across water and more difficult to accomplish. And yet, when you talk about the trade-off between Ukraine and Taiwan, is this current administration, the Trump administration, are they shifting more attention, less attention, same attention to the Taiwan problem, which seems to grow more urgent every time they hold a parade? You can see it,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
Well, and before I get to the first part, there's actually things that have been happening recently that in addition to the parade that also greatly complicate what we're trying to do, because you could divide people who look at the Chinese military basically into looking at three different scenarios. One is that amphibious invasion, the sort of D-Day redux. The second is a blockade, given how incredibly dependent Taiwan is, 90% of its fuel, all these sorts of things. And then there's also the threat of sort of a firepower campaign where China just stands off and just hits Taiwan with missiles, very similar to what's happening in Ukraine, and just tries to sort of shatter political will on the island to again effectuate that political solution, vice having to invade the place and take it over. And the thing is that we're trying to actually provide them with the kind of weapons some people call it the porcupine strategy, where you just don't want to attack Taiwan. Because they're going to have large numbers of drones and they're going to have all the kinds of things we've seen in Ukraine. I actually don't detect at the political levels of this administration any interest in bolstering Taiwan's defenses in the same way that I don't see any interest in them really aggressively defending Ukraine. It tends to be a bit more of a sort of fend for yourself. And there is widespread suspicion that part of the grand bargain that the president seeks to strike with Xi Jinping in Beijing will involve settlement of the Taiwan issue.
yeah, based on what one understands as far as one can, the president's strategic vision, basically of strong men, strong nations, spheres of influence. You guys get that part, you guys get that part, we get this part, and that would leave Taiwan high and dry.
Well, I mean, it would be a very transactional thing for a president that prides himself on being very transactional.
Yeah.
And keep in mind that Taiwan has very few intense friends left in the world,
Oh,
and most of our European allies believe that the U.S. attitude about Taiwan is anachronistic, that it's ahistorical, that it's sort of outlived its usefulness, that Taiwan is basically a custom zone of the PRC, and are really not focused on a values discussion about 23 million people who live under a very vibrant democracy. Now, Taiwan, for its part, listened to Beijing over many years about this promise of so-called one country, two systems, where they, other than having the Chinese
yeah.
flag, that China would run Taiwan's foreign policy and its defense policy, but other than that, nothing would change. But then they look at Hong Kong
Hong Kong.
and they say, that's a lie. You're,
Yeah.
one country, two systems is completely bankrupt. We don't believe that anymore. All you have to do is look at Hong Kong.
But they're relatively friendless in the world, despite their democratic values and their closeness to us in terms of values. Much of the West has decided they are worth it.
Well, I mean, yeah, because in the realpolitik of it, obviously, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, their relationship, those countries' relationships with the PRC are just so much more critical. If you look at all of the percentages of trade and all those things, so most of Taiwan's remaining friends are small countries in Central America and small islands in the South Pacific. And in a lot of cases, it's because the Taiwans were the last ones to land with a plane with a suitcase full of money, and then and have built them a new presidential palace and a new soccer stadium and a new foreign ministry building and and all these sorts of things. And so it is very sort of crass and transactional down at that level. St. Kitts
Yes,
and Nevis, Caribbean countries, things like that.
man, it doesn't seem very reliable if I'm a Taiwanese free person and business person. But let me turn back to the hardware for a second. One of the other impressions I got from that magnificent parade and all that was, wow, maybe it wasn't such a good idea for the United States to offshore so much of its manufacturing sector if we're actually going to be in an arms race of some kind with an economy the size of China's, who are already clearly, outbuilding us.
Well, I mean, and here, I don't take any joy in it, but I was always a Cassandra about globalization. And in its purest form, the belief that as I see it from sort of the Davos perspective, that world capital and world industry would find the best clustering locations to build things around the world that were the most efficient, and then the whole global population would benefit from all of those efficiencies in terms of ready access to cheap goods and things along those lines. As you know, I spent a lot of my career working on Chinese cyber espionage and technology espionage. And so I was always deeply skeptical of the idea that we should move the entire information and communication technology manufacturing base in the world to a country that was simultaneously the number one cyber threat actor to the United States. And all of those birds, unfortunately, Terry, have come home to roost. And it took COVID really to remind us, because as under that conceit of globalization I mentioned earlier, the PPE, the medical equipment, should have gone where the market told it to go. And instead, the Chinese government weighed in and goes, no, 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 no. National boundaries still matter. And we need that stuff for us. And that really shattered the whole sort of structural and ideological conceit of globalization. And we've been sort of disentangling it and tearing it apart ever since. But yes, we are now seeing the fruits of moving advanced manufacturing to China, and the Chinese policies of military civil fusion made it very easy for them to then convert those methodologies and those processes and that equipment into an incredibly impressive military modernization program.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to get to. But first, COVID. In some ways, COVID, in the way you're describing it, which is that it was a wake up call for the United States, for the people of the United States. Right? We couldn't get our packages anymore. To think again about the offshoring of so much of the manufacturing in this country. Although I think people, it was always the investor class that liked that. Obviously, it wasn't the communities where manufacturers in America were, but it was a wake up call that could have been a lot worse, is what you're saying. But digression, because you mentioned COVID. What's your take on the lab leak versus natural origin or cooked up? Because I did a story early on. It's frankly the worst experience I ever had at ABC News in January of 2021, I guess. No, January 2022. So it was not even a year, really. Well, when it was about a year later, it was in 2020 to 2022. It was a little bit more than a year. So I thought I'd been seeing some smart people out there. You probably know some of them. And I was seeing them. They were saying, that looks like it might have been a lab leak. I thought, hey, we should do a story on this. And Nightline said, yeah, let's go. And so I reported it, and I talked to high-level scientists who believed it was natural origin, would be demonstrated, smart people, high-level scientists who believed the other thing. I laid it out. Let's just say it did not survive. The script I wrote did not survive because at the time it was verboten in mainstream media to say that it might have been a lab leak.
Sure.
I've actually never watched the piece all the way through because it was so frustrating it was one of the only times that ever happened where it was
Yeah.
changed in my judgment for ideological reasons. We were told by Dr. Fauci and others not to, and so it turned out differently. All that by way of preface, I have kind of a personal, emotional stake in this. Not that I ended up actually thinking after all that research It's probably natural origin, but I wouldn't be surprised if it came out of that lab. What do you think?
I think there's a lot of evidence, unfortunately, for both of the cases. And what I would say is, without coming to a conclusion about one or the other, China's behavior
Mm.
is what I focus on, which is the cover up, the destruction of the data, the refusal to allow a real independent international inquiry, the counterattacking by insisting that, in fact, Americans brought COVID to China during the World Military Games in Wuhan. I think that China's handling of COVID actually is the real story in many ways, because it exposed all of the darkest and
Mm.
worst parts of sort of Leninist authoritarianism, the brittleness of China to dealing with international criticism, its incredible actions to try and smother any attempt to try and figure that out in a responsible way. All of those show us that China rejects the rule-based international order.
Yeah,
Imagine, an airplane crash or something like that, in which you send international investigation teams to try and figure out what's going on. China broke every rule in that international playbook for dealing with something like this. And people are right to be angry about it. And the bottom line is that every single flu-based virus that circulates the world all come from China. And we know this. And so they, in a sense, by their handling of it, created the very ambiguity and questions that they're so pissed off about. So it's really, so I have no sympathy for their irritation about all of that, because if they had simply come clean and been more open to international investigation, then people wouldn't be talking about the same theory.
exactly. It's what they call in the American courts evidence of consciousness of guilt. If you're trying to cover
Yep.
something up, that's
Yeah. Yeah.
admissible as evidence of consciousness of guilt. All right, thank you for that. But back to the hard problem, the military challenge that China represents, and beyond the military China challenge that China represents. You talked about cyber, and that you're obviously
Mhm.
deeply involved in that as well. Uh, the theft of intellectual property was another aspect of that did so much intellectual economic damage in this country. I remember talking to a steel manufacturer in Baltimore when Trump put his tariffs on in the first term, and he was praising him. He's a longtime Baltimore Democrat. He said, "These guys literally just take my website. I've got patents, and they just rip it off. They use the same pictures, put it in Chinese, and sell at half the price, and they're killing me." So
Mhm.
that's one aspect of cyber. But the more deeper and more difficult aspect that I want to ask is the penetration that it seems every week, learn deeper and deeper into the deepest recesses of the American security systems and established. How concerned are you about how much China has penetrated our military and intelligence and security systems, and how deeply?
I'm extremely concerned about it. As I said, I was an early Cassandra on this topic, and for quite a few years was told that I was out of my mind. From like 97 to roughly 2005, was told that I was crazy for thinking that the Chinese were interested in cyber espionage, capable of cyber espionage. And then with the Google Aurora case in 2009, it's just been, frankly, a steady drumbeat of sort of horribles. The most recent of which, Salt and Volt Typhoon, which are two different Chinese espionage campaigns, are by far the worst ever. Although you could argue that the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, where along with 2,100 million security clearance holders, all of our personal information was exfiltrated to China, and probably the single greatest counterintelligence disaster in U.S. history. That was a big deal. But Salt Typhoon, as we found from the news the other day, is the intrusion into the telecom system. And you
Right.
know what, Terry? I was testifying before Senate Banking about this. I'm proud to say I actually made Ted Cruz laugh at one point, which I didn't think was possible. But it's not. If you look at the announcements that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI and NSA and others have put out versus previous ones, you know what's missing? the patch to fix it, the recommended patches. You know why? Because the systems, the hardware systems inside the core telecommunications infrastructure in the United States that the Chinese are exploiting are not patchable. They need to just it would cost tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to do a massive rip and replace of those systems. So, despite the fact that the government has acknowledged that Salt Typhoon in particular is a thing, they also acknowledge that the vulnerability that was used to get in and exploit it has not been fixed and can't be fixed until they replace all of that equipment.
That's incredible. So wait, so China's now a permanent resident in these systems?
Yes. Yes. And so that's why despite my ADD and despite the dopamine I get from it, I'm spending a lot less quality time with my iPhone these days.
Huh.
And here, the company I work in, phones aren't allowed in any conference room for any meeting. Partially that keeps people's attention, so they're not just
Right. That absolutely.
playing words with friends during the finance and accounting meeting. But yeah, no, I mean it's not remediable. And even now, you could say, I mean, we could get really deep into this. It's like, well, what about Signal, right? The thing is, the Apple iPhone is built in a way where individual apps can't really bleed into other apps, right? So you can't move laterally. But where the Chinese are is in the telecoms infrastructure, not the phone. And so at the transport layer, so all of the phone calls and voicemails and all of that. So there may be end-to-end encrypted apps, but in terms of being able to use ad tech to monitor the geolocation of phones, track people, listen to their calls, listen to their voicemails. Yeah, no, it hasn't been fixed, and it won't be fixed.
All right, I'm going to ask you. I mean, that's terrifying, frankly. We've talked about the ominous and continuously rising power of China in various spheres. But let's talk about a couple of vulnerabilities. First, Xi Jinping himself. He's obviously a very strong leader, has a kind of revanchist vision, right? He wants Maoism back as much as possible. It feels like. Is there any way of gauging the support, the actual support that he has, and does it matter?
Well, I mean, the thing is that there are a number of levers that you need to have your hands on in order to have power in China. Popular support is not one of them. You need to control the propaganda apparatus. You need to have your own people at the top of the military. You need to control the internal security apparatus. I mean, keep in mind, Terry, that the internal security budget is every year is larger than the national defense budget in China, and they've acknowledged that.
Internal
And
security, meaning
the
monitoring their
internal
own people.
security the internal security budget is larger than the national defense budget, and we have been commenting on the incredible growth of the national defense budget. So that, by definition, tells you what the growth of the internal security budget has been. Um, and so those are the things that keep a Leninist authoritarian leader in power. But many people believe that Xi Jinping has overstepped, even by party norms, by being the chairman of everything, by rejecting the collective leadership of his the two previous general secretaries, and these massive anti-corruption purges, hundreds of thousands of party officials, thousands of military officers, including large numbers of the most senior officers, and yet the corruption doesn't go away, despite the fact that this campaign has been running for over a decade. And it really sort of gets to the rot that is in the Chinese system in terms of the lack of accountability and the ease of graft and all these sorts of things. So he's sitting on top of a very sick system. He's sitting on top of a sick economy. He's sitting on top of the world's largest environmental disaster. He's sitting on top of the world's largest public health disaster in terms of lack of social safety net. So he's got a dozen problems, any one of which would bring a well-functioning democracy to its knees, and he's got a dozen of them.
Hmm.
And he's increasingly relying on coercion, and the secret police, and really clamping down on speech, and all of the things that were the oxygen that was driving this economic miracle. And I think that's why you see large scale capital flight and you see elites leaving and making sure that they have a second passport and can get out of China. And so there's a lot of people who think that we'll look at that and say, have we reached peak China? In other words, did they take off on this rocket ship and have they sort of stalled out at the top from overspending on property and bridges and airports and high-speed rail and all these sort of tinker toys? And do they really have a system that is sustainable? And that this is his number one concern, because that will directly lead to problems with social stability, which is the number one concern of the leadership. Not Taiwan, not the US, but internal social stability.
And that economy, which he's directed essentially, and gotten more government control of, made some really bad calls. It feels like that now, may present, as you point out, kind of political pressure, if there is such a thing, in China. And then there's a birth rate issue as well, obviously in all developed countries, just about, including this one. But in China, it seems worse.
No, it is. I mean, just on your first point, Xi Jinping, and this is my personal opinion. In China, you point at your nose when you're talking about yourself. My personal opinion is that he actually believes what he's saying about socialism and the new Chinese path to socialism. And as a student of history, you could look at the period from 1978 to the present as just a really long Leninist period of new economic policy, like Lenin did from 19 to 21, where he said, we got to do a little bit of capitalism to get to an economic level where we can do a lot of socialism, right? And so he honestly believes that he has found a new path to socialism. So he has reintroduced the centrality of state-owned enterprises and central planning, and in a sense is snuffing out a lot of the engine of he's choking the engine of private enterprise that really drove that first 25 or 30 years of Chinese economic growth. Then on the birth rate side, this is what happens when you massively fuck with a country's birth rate. So Chairman Mao says, have as many kids as you want. Because the more kids we have, the more people will survive the global nuclear war that I'm about to wage, and then the world will be Chinese and communist, right? But then in the late 70s, bam, they stop, and then they have the one-child policy, which created this demographic sort of tsunami, which is now biting them in the butt, and now their population is aging more every year. And like you said, like most developed countries, they're not having as many babies, but the weird part is the Confucian Leninist authoritarian governance idea, which is now they're telling young women to stop working, stop getting college degrees, have babies. The fact that there's no woman on the Politburo, all of these sort of patriarchal and more traditional notions have come out, and that's caused a huge backlash among a liberated bourgeois young female population that said, Taylor Swift doesn't agree with you. I'm going with Tay Tay.
Do you see any of that in Chinese society? Do you see any of that frustration? Do you see any sign of discontent manifesting in everyday ordinary life?
Well, yeah. Well, there's a couple of interesting metrics, and the Chinese have admitted this. So China, for many years, has announced that they have had over what they call 100,000 mass incidents per year, as a justification for the fact that their internal security budget is higher than their national defense budget. So then, let's do some quick math. So you divide 100,000 by 30 provinces, right? So that's 3,000 incidents a year per province, right? And then 365 days. So now you're looking at like 8 or 9 a month per province. These are mass incidents. These are more than 100 people showing up in a place really pissed off about something.
Huh.
So basically, on any given day, a governor or a party secretary in a province in China is leveraging paramilitary forces to put down some sort of a mass incident, right? So this is kind of a boiling kind of system. And the Chinese use all of their technology to make sure to localize what's going on, right? Because the thing they care most about WeChat and the internet and all the technologies and mobile phones is not shit talking Chinese leaders. That happens all the time. The number one they think they care about is the use of these technologies to organize collective action over distance.
Contagion.
Yeah, so they want to localize everything. And you saw that out the door with COVID, right? But frankly, the zero COVID policy was one of the first things where we saw Xi Jinping actually have to do a complete 180 and stop the policy because people just said, Uncle, too much. We can't do this. I cannot starve in my apartment complex for another week.
Mm.
I'm going to go out in the street. And that was a rare case in which widespread popular discontent led to dramatic change of policy.
Well, that I want to pick up on something there. The math that you just did, which is that there are a significant number of mass incidents, people getting together, pissed off, in enough of a crowd to cause concern, so that it gets reported to the government. A, we never see any of that. That very rarely. And B, maybe they're inflating their numbers to get a bigger budget.
Well, I mean, we do see some of it. I mean, the thing is, there's a whole subgroup of people on Twitter, X, and other places that are constantly posting sort of camera phone videos of protests here or sort of a riot there or something along those lines. But the Chinese, as you know, in the late '90s, when I wrote my first book on Chinese internet censorship. There was a widespread belief among people that no authoritarian regime could withstand the introduction of these liberating technologies. And I think the story of the last 30 years has been sort of this very dystopian Black Mirror kind of reversal on that, where in fact authoritarian regimes became very adept at using this for controlling and manipulating and everything else. And it didn't end up being a liberating technology. But the bottom line is that they do a fantastic job of censoring that material so that it doesn't get to the outside world. And instead, abroad, as you know from if you've been on Twitter and all these platforms, Chinese information operations is very different than Russian. Chinese information operations really only has two features. One, having people talk about how great China is and all of China's accomplishments, and then people very angrily refuting criticism of China. That's very different than the Russians, who, befitting a country that gave us Dostoevsky, are just pure nihilists, who pit left against right and right against left and the middle against everybody and discredit institutions and everything else. Chinese IO is actually much easier to spot because it's so sort of ideologically jacketed into those two buckets. And a
Yeah,
lot of it is meant, hey, look at our high-speed trains.
that's
Don't
it.
look at this protest over here.
Well, I do look at those high-speed trains and the gleaming towers and the incredibly quick building bridges and all the rest of it. And I'm impressed because X is kind of full of that stuff, and it would be, and the algorithm seems to favor it as well because it's cool to look at, right? I mean, I guess it is. But let me turn back to security for a moment and North Korea, all right,
Hmm.
which is, I mean, essentially, it seems to me that from the United States perspective, Trump kind of solved the North Korean nuclear problem by surrendering to it, by essentially acknowledging that North Korea is now a nuclear power and we can't do anything about it. For decades, American presidents had tried all kinds of things with some degree of success and then not to keep a lid on North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Now they're a nuclear power for what it's worth. Is that a bigger problem for China now?
I think, in fact, a lot of the sort of signals, if you will, coming out of Beijing suggest that they are very, very concerned, as always. They've been very concerned about the North Koreans for a long time. They're sort of the crazy uncle who lives in the attic of China. And they believed they had a lot of leverage over the North because they were so reliant on oil and other things from China. What's been the big change since 2014 is that the North Koreans went all in with the Russians on providing them with weapons and ammunition and even troops for the war in Ukraine. And so there's tremendous concern in Beijing that, in fact, Pyongyang and Moscow are a lot
Mhm.
closer right now in that triangle, and that China doesn't have as much leverage over Pyongyang as it did before. And therefore, if Putin is sort of unleashing the North Koreans to do crazy stuff to sort of create problems for NATO and the United States in other parts of the world, which is a classic North Korean look at me kind of strategy. I think that's really a dynamic that I'm actually quite concerned about.
And Russia providing the hard money that can lift up the Kim Jong Un elite at any rate.
Right. Well,
Because I
yeah.
remember when I was in North Korea for one of the party congresses, I think where he was proclaimed dear great eternal leader forever, or maybe the head of the military as well, or both. I had the best piece of foie gras I've ever had. So
Hmm.
my
Yeah.
translate was it was shocking and shameful because I knew people were hungry. There were two things I remember about being in Pyongyang. I tried to get out, but outside of the city, but couldn't. One, that when people were coming up out of the subways at rush hour or down into them, utter silence. Nobody talked to each other.
Hmm.
It was only the littlest children were heard. You could hear their voices laughing and giggling, but as soon as they got to be about 7, 8, 9 years old, same. No, it was the eeriest thing I've ever. And on the last day, our minder, fixer, translator, spy, whatever, said, "I'll take you to Kim Jong Un's favorite restaurant." And we went to this brand new complex, gyms, pools, and a restaurant. And there was a foie gras kind of teriyaki style or whatever, and it was extraordinary. And clearly, whatever we were trying to sanction them out of
Hmm.
wasn't working, at least for the lives of the elite.
Right.
Something was leaking through counterfeits, drugs, money from Russia. They seem to be living just fine, Kim Jong Un and his pals.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is that one of the interesting sort of not unexpected, but sort of unintentional consequences of the sanctions on Russia is it forced them entirely to engage in non-international monetary relationships with other countries. And so that's also been true in China, where the lack of convertibility of the RMB meant that Russia had a monetary policy option that was outside of the Western system. And they have relied on that, and they've also relied for barter with the North Koreans and things along those lines. So in a sense, that axis of chaos, North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, they have sort of sustained each other despite the outside opprobrium and sanctions regimes, through the trading of natural materials, natural resources, and things along those lines. It's clearly not sustainable, and it had to be bolstered by massive illegal networks. You've probably heard of the Lazarus Group, which is the North Korean hacking gang that pulls off large bank heists on the internet using the SWIFT system and stealing large amounts of Bitcoin, doing rip and runs on badly defended Bitcoin marketplaces, all of which is funding Kim Jong Un's My Box and his taste for Swedish hookers, and his porn collection, and all of that.
All right, I'm drawing you a little bit past what your core expertise is, but you're obviously knowledgeable across the board. Let's talk about tariffs, right?
Mhm.
This breakage. I remember this is one of the things that I thought, A, why Trump won in 2016, and B, why he really did change American politics through sheer force of personality, but also because he represented the anti-globalizer, right? The
Yep.
anti-consensus, anti-neoliberal consensus. And I remember after he was elected in 2016, before he was inaugurated, there was a company in Indianapolis, Carrier, the air conditioning company, that said they were shipping 1,100 jobs to Mexico. And Trump, who was only president-elect at that point, said, no, this is wrong. Corporations
Mhm.
shouldn't do that. Now, we're all used to that hammer coming down on, on all kinds of ways, universities, law
Yeah.
firms, companies, you name it. But I remember thinking, why have I never heard any other president in the era of globalization tell an American corporation that that's not what we mean? We've gone too far. On China, that's Trump policies writ large, which I think are appealed to people. But now he's really out to break the whole relationship. And what do you think of that policy? And what impact is it having? Will it have, because it's relatively recent, on China going forward?
Well, the thing is to be fair to the president, he has believed firmly and ideologically in tariffs for 40 years.
Yep.
I don't know who taught him that at Wharton, but he has believed that for a long, long time.
Yep.
And believes that this is the way, the very painful, hard way to break the globalization ecosystem and to restore American manufacturing. The dilemma I have about tariffs is obviously we could, we don't, none of us believe that it's a source of treasury revenue, and that the price of ground beef now is $6.15 a pound at the grocery store, which is the highest it's ever been, and things along those lines. But that being said, there are two ways to think about it. One is his use of tariffs as a negotiating tactic to hammer people at the negotiating table to then give up major concessions about the dynamics of the way that our bilateral trade relationships work. And that appears to be having some positive effects. And you have to really believe in tariffs for that negotiating tactic to work. The other one has been instituting a base level of tariff. And again, I have never had a lot of respect in my career for economists. So I'm not going to cite any economic theory on this. But it's going to be very hard to undo 30 years of bad decisions. And why did no previous president do this? As you said, I'm going to go right to Citizens United.
Yep.
The donor class.
Yep.
The donor class for both parties was heavy in Wall Street and in banking and heavy in the C-suite. And those are the people who made the money from hollowing out American manufacturing and shipping it abroad. And then they reinforced that with political influence through open money and dark money contributions.
Absolutely. And Trump was the first person to call BS on the whole thing, because, as you point out, well, one thing that's consistent with him, he has this commitment to this vision of the American economy. And I remember, one of my pet peeves is that one of the reasons we got Citizens United is because we have a court that I describe as dweebish, because they have no practical experience in statecraft at all. I've said this a couple times and written it. They were all essentially from the same mold, in contrast to previous courts who always had people who had run for office, people who had power in their hands, understood its temptations, understood its ramifications. The last person who had run for office to sit on the Supreme Court was Sandra Day O'Connor. She had run for state legislature and state Supreme Court in Arizona. And she left, and the year after she left, they did Citizens United. And she said, not in so many words, but very clearly, that she would have voted differently because she'd been a politician and she knew that money isn't speech. It's money. It's money.
Yep.
And I think you're exactly right. Well, I want to get one more big topic in, if you don't mind. You've been generous with your time. And that's the big question, right? Given the military capacities that you've talked about there, the intelligence campaigns they continue to run against the United States, all their weaknesses. You're the president of the United States right now. What should the United States do to counter China and remain at peace with it?
Well, there's a couple of things we can do. And some of the reorgs that are going on in the Department of Defense and some of the ways it's pivoting are actually very, very helpful. But, and this is not going to be welcome to the current administration. But at the end of the day, the numerical superiority of the Chinese forces is such that we have to use asymmetric means to be able to deter them for the time being from carrying out military operations for the retake of Taiwan. And so it's not bullet for bullet. It's not missile for missile. But it is really denying China the opportunity to be able to, actually consolidate Taiwan rather than just destroy it. And, we see a lot of the secrets of this in the Ukraine war with Russia, which is to say, and we see some nascent efforts of this, but, it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese to get amphibious lift across the Taiwan Strait if they're met by a very large scale drone swarm coming out of Taiwan. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to be able to maintain, various naval and air superiority if they're surrounded by large numbers of UASs and UUVs and things like that. So, they're trying to actually build a fairly conventional military. And my point would be the response is much more of an unconventional military. Now, and that's what the Defense Innovation Unit, that's what the new breed of defense industry companies like Anduril and Saronic and companies like that, they totally buy into that vision. And so the question is the lobbying power of Lockheed and General Dynamics and Boeing sufficient to sort of keep us going down the same path? Because U.S. military procurement to this point has been kind of a disaster, and is really a manifestation of the weakening and undermining of our manufacturing base more broadly. And
How so? How so?
well, in the sense, well, I mean, because we had to have massive defense contractor consolidation, because the Navy was buying fewer and fewer platforms. We had consolidation of shipyards. So, you've probably seen these statistics recently. China easily produces 90% plus of the world's commercial shipping now. And those same shipyards that build all that commercial shipping are also building Chinese gray hulls. And so when you upgrade the chemical bath and you upgrade the crane and you go from doing keel up construction to modular construction like they do in commercial shipbuilding, they just naturally started doing it on the military side as well. And so that's really military civil fusion, because it was all the underlying knowledge about how to build ships that then helped them build better naval combatants. And that's that linkage between the Chinese economic miracle and the military modernization sort of miracle. That being said, I'm a big fan of alliances. We obviously can't defend Taiwan by ourselves. The Japanese, in particular, have an incredibly well technologically advanced and powerful military. We've been building friendships in the Philippines so that we have expeditionary operations from their territory. We had been doing a good job previously of increasingly integrating the Europeans and their militaries into Pacific rotations. Again, just to put more deterrence in the box, if you will, at any given moment, so that China was disincentivized to do the things it wanted to do. But I'm a wholesale supporter of Taiwan, and defending its democratic system. Because Taiwan, and this is sort of a final comment, Taiwan is the prima facie evidence that Chinese culture is not incompatible with democracy like Beijing says it is. The Chinese, the Kuomintang, the KMT in Taiwan was also a Leninist party founded by the Comintern that then turned itself inside out and democratized the island. So I think in many ways, Taiwan represents China's greatest nightmare, because it almost doesn't want its population to know that there's an alternate path, that some people who look like you, sound like you, began with the same origins politically as you, ended up in a different place than where you are.
And so worth the American commitment, such as it is.
I think so. And I also, I know some people poo-poo this, but I also believe that while the world may not value Taiwan like we do, they will be looking at our defense of Taiwan as evidence of the credibility of our defense commitments around the globe, in the same way that our policy towards Ukraine, which did such a great job of unifying us with the Europeans in ways that was unprecedented since the end of the Cold War, and now it's fracturing.
That's all gone.
Yeah, imagine the same level of a unifying effect if we're all defending the same values and against people whose political systems seem to be ascendant, but are in fact are not the same values. And I always tell people, who brag to me about China, I say, well, tell me, That's great. High speed trains, whatever. Tom Friedman writes another column where he's like, "I'd gladly give up democracy for high speed trains." We're like, "Thanks, Tom." And I just say to them, which political culture would you want to live in?
Hmm.
Which milieu would you want to live in?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you'd
that
get there on time, but
you're talking the language of values now, and
yeah,
I'm going to say this. You don't have to, but clearly, that is not the language or understanding or approach of the current administration, and so the kind of solidarity that you're talking about is broken in Europe, and I would suggest can't be counted on in the Pacific either under this administration, and maybe that's what the American people want at the moment. But James Mulvenon, it's been great conversation, really, really interesting and informative, and I really appreciate you coming on. Um, and as developments warrant, I'd love you to come back if possible.
oh, I would love to come back too, and I give you a 10 out of 10 on Room Raider. Love the asymmetric bookshelves. Glad you didn't
That's
do
just
the
because I can't look.
no. But I'm glad you didn't do the stupid color coordinated books of the same color all in a row. I mean,
No,
but Johanna would never have let you do that. So
no, 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 and maybe I should have actually tried to turn it so it was facing me, but
no, I've been moving it around for the last hour. So
all right, James, thanks very much. And thanks to all. I'll put this up on Substack and we'll clip it and send it around as well. James,
all
thanks
right,
very
thank you,
much.
thank you, brother. See you soon.
You bet. See you.